In a follow-up to their first video report covering the elements needed to prove a claim of fraud, the League of Restorative Justice provides us now with a video that emphasizes how important it is for parties to an agreement to fully understand its terms. This work shows exactly what Oasis International Group promised each signatory to the Oasis Promissory Note and Agreement, which, as you'll clearly see, did not include any share of gains or losses that resulted from investments the company made using monies loaned to it under that agreement.
Contract law is the law of promises. Contracts in many different forms shape the civilized world, and where necessary, their lawful enforcement helps keep it in good order. From business agreements and financial transactions to bonds of friendship, pledges of fidelity, and the vows of marriage, indentures, agreements, oaths, and covenants, contract law defines the expectations and responsibilities of parties to such contract relationships. But what happens when the terms of a contract are misunderstood, ignored, or misinterpreted? Today we'll examine some illuminating cases that reveal why legally endorsed terms of an agreement must be read, understood, and honored in detail. This will help explain what happened in the Oasis case, where they weren't. Through the few stories presented here, we hope to help you grasp the sometimes extreme consequences of paying inadequate attention to the terms of a contract. We'll start with The Merchant of Venice, a play by William Shakespeare published in 1600. Even though it's 425 years old, there's no story in the English language that more powerfully illustrates the importance of giving agreements due attention and respect. We'll focus on the play's famous case of Shylock versus Antonio. But The Merchant of Venice also presents examples of the bonds of friendship, the importance of oaths and pledges of fidelity, as well as vows of betrothal and marriage. We strongly recommend you watch the magnificently produced full feature presentation of the 2004 release by 20th Century Fox. We'll summarize a Bible story from the Book of Joshua that illustrates how dire consequences may befall those who enter an agreement without exercising sufficient due diligence beforehand. And we'll close with an examination of a real case filed in 1988 by Apple Computer against Microsoft that dramatically exposed the nearly catastrophic cost of assuming a contractual stipulation that was not stated in the agreement between them. Finally, we'll offer a clear examination of Oasis's promissory note and agreement, which lies at the heart of every Oasis case. An ancient maxim of law holds that the most important part of anything is its beginning, and there's no question that the relationship between Oasis and every one of its lenders began with the lender first signing Oasis's promissory note and agreement. We believe that the CFTC and the U.S. Department of Justice materially misrepresented the agreement in order to fabricate several costly civil cases, and that the terms of the agreement offered the most powerful but shamefully overlooked defense for Michael DeCorta against the criminal charges brought against him.
The Merchant of Venice is the most famous and perhaps most comprehensive public examination of contracts in the English language, and certainly the most exquisitely expressed one. We open with a short scene where the merchant Antonio secures a loan from the moneylender Shylock to help his friend Bassanio, who needs the money to court the wealthy Portia. The agreement between Shylock and Antonio is clear. If Antonio cannot repay the loan according to its terms, he will forfeit a pound of his flesh to Shylock.
Go with me to a notary and seal me there your single bond, and in a merry sport, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such a sum or sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh, to be cut off and taken in what part of your body pleaseth me.
Contenti, Faith. I'll seal such a bond and say there is much kindness in the Jew.
While Bassanio is away pressing his suit for marriage to Portia, Antonio's ships are lost at sea, with the result that he cannot pay his debt. Shylock, wronged by Venetian society and feeling vengeful over the unwanted marriage of his daughter to a Christian, goes to court to demand the strict enforcement of his bond against Antonio. The court becomes a battleground where law and vengeance clash with mercy. Shylock argues for the law to enforce his contract. Bassanio asks the Duke of Venice and his court to take the law into their own hands to prevent the terrible contract from being enforced, but the young judge Balthazar, who is Portia in disguise, informs the Duke that to do so is impossible under the law, and would set a terrible precedent for the city that would dishonour its credibility and encourage unscrupulous actions to follow.
I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond.
Is he not able to discharge the money?
Yes, here. I tendered it for him in court, yea, twice the sum. If that is not enough, I will be bound to pay it 10 times. Oh, on forfeit of my hands, my head, my heart. If this is not enough, it must appear that malice bears down on truth. I beseech you, rest once the law to your authority to do a great right, do a little wrong, and curb this cruel devil of his will.
It must not be. There is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. We recorded for a precedent, and many an error of the same example will rush into the state. It cannot be.
Portia, as Balthazar, asks that Shylock take the offer of double his bonded sum, but he declares that he has a superseding oath in heaven that forbids it. Portia therefore declares the bond forfeit. Thus, Antonio is bound by the terms of his contract with Shylock for having failed to meet its stated conditions on time. Portia makes one final appeal for Shylock to take the money, but he merely replies, "When it is paid, according to the terms."
Shylock, there is twice the money offered you.
An oath! An oath! I have an oath in heaven. Shall I lay perjury upon my soul? No. Not for Venice.
Why, this bond is forfeit. And lawfully at this time the Jew may claim a pound of flesh, to be by him cut off nearest the merchant's heart. Be merciful. Take twice your money. Bid me tear the bond.
When it is paid, according to the terms.
Portia has Antonio prepare for Shylock to exact his payment, and makes one last appeal to Shylock to at least have a doctor in attendance to stop Antonio from bleeding to death after he does so. But Shylock responds that doing so is not in the contract, and so refuses.
Have by some surgeon, Shylock, on your charge, to stop his wounds, lest he should bleed to death.
Is it so nominated in the bond?
It is not so expressed. But what of that? 'Twere good you do so much for charity.
I cannot find it. 'Tis not in the bond.
Antonio is strapped to a chair as Shylock sharpens his knife, and the onlookers cringe at what is about to happen. But just before he cuts into Antonio's breast, Portia stops him. She then uses the very letter of the law to undo Shylock's claim. By exposing the flaw in his contract, he may take the pound of Antonio's flesh, but not a single drop of blood. The contract allows him the flesh, but not a drop of blood, an impossible condition. By the terms of his own bargain, Shylock is undone. Once confident in his contract's strength, he now finds himself ensnared by a loophole he had overlooked. He is not just denied repayment. By his unyielding insistence on enforcement of the strict terms of his bond, he is branded a criminal, stripped of his wealth, and forced to submit to the court's will.
A little. There is something else. This bond does give you here no drop of blood. The words expressly are a pound of flesh. Take then your bond, take then your pound of flesh. But in the cutting of it, if you do shed one drop of Christian blood, your lands and goods are by the laws of Venice confiscate, and to the state of Venice.
When the merchant, Antonio, borrowed money from Shylock to aid his friend Bassanio, the terms seemed straightforward. If Antonio failed to repay, Shylock could take a pound of his flesh. But did Antonio fully understand the terms and potential consequences of his contract, or did he simply ignore them under the mistaken belief that there was no chance of them coming to fruition? If he assumed that good faith would override the contract's literal enforcement, doing so almost cost him his life. The lesson is clear. A contract is not just words on paper. It is power, a tool that can be used to enforce justice or to destroy lives. Those who fail to grasp an agreement's full meaning may find themselves at the mercy of a system that serves not truth, but those who manipulate it for their own enlargement. As Antonio's wealth vanished with his lost ships, Shylock demanded strict adherence to the terms of their agreement. A court of law should merely enforce the contract, as it did in this case, but when the power of state authority intervenes, interpretation may be weaponized to serve interests that have little or nothing to do with the original parties to the case. The law, though intended to uphold fairness, justice, and equity, can be twisted, not to protect the lender or the borrower, but instead to serve the interests of those in control.
The Bible offers many examples of people giving oaths, making contracts, and binding themselves under covenant agreements. It also clearly illustrates consequences that follow after the default of an agreement. For example, in the book of Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites, fearing Israel's conquest, tricked Joshua into a peace treaty by making it appear that they've traveled a great distance and pretending to be from a distant land. God had commanded Israel not to make treaties with nearby nations. Once the truth is revealed, Joshua cannot break the contract with the Gibeonites because he swore an oath before God.
The nations of Canaan were determined to resist the Israelites, but the Gibeonites, who lived nearby, had no illusions about their chances in battle. Disguising themselves as weary travelers from a distant land, the Gibeonites loaded their donkeys with worn-out sacks, cracked wineskins, and stale bread. Their clothing was tattered, their sandals patched, and their story carefully crafted. They went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." Joshua 9:6. The Gibeonites' ruse was brilliant. By posing as foreigners from a far-off land, they sought to exploit a loophole in Israel's instructions. God had commanded the Israelites to utterly destroy the inhabitants of Canaan, leaving no room for alliances or compromises, Deuteronomy 7:1-2. But this command didn't apply to nations outside the land, and the Gibeonites hoped to deceive Israel into making a treaty under false pretenses. The Israelites examined the Gibeonites' outward appearance and listened to their persuasive words, but they failed to seek God's guidance. It was a costly oversight, one that would have lasting consequences. Joshua made a covenant with the Gibeonites, swearing to let them live, and the leaders of Israel confirmed the agreement with an oath.
Before making the pact with the Gibeonites, Joshua and his leaders failed to scrutinize the terms of the agreement, and therefore accepted the Gibeonites' ruse without due diligence. Contracts are binding. Failing to investigate and verify details before making agreements can lead to unintended and highly undesirable consequences. Israel was bound by the agreement and had to spare the Gibeonites, which complicated their conquest and led to ongoing tensions. This story highlights the peril of entering an agreement without fully investigating and understanding its terms and implications.
The roots of the case, filed against Microsoft Corporation by Apple Computer on March 17, 1988, trace to a 1985 agreement between Apple and Microsoft, whereby Apple had licensed Microsoft to use certain visual aspects of Apple's proprietary Lisa and Macintosh Graphical User Interfaces, GUIs, in Windows 1.0 in exchange for Microsoft's commitment to develop software for the Mac. But Apple failed to impose contractual limitations or clearly define the scope of the license to prevent Microsoft from expanding its use of the GUI elements in future versions of Windows. When Microsoft released Windows 2.03 in 1987, Apple argued that they had exceeded the 1985 agreement's intent, but the lack of explicit contractual restrictions opened the door for Microsoft's broader interpretation of the license. The consequence of Apple's failure to limit Microsoft's use of its GUI in the 1985 agreement was decisive in the courts ultimately ruling in Microsoft's favor by determining that the 1985 license covered most of the disputed elements in subsequent Windows developments. Apple's loss stemmed directly from its failure to carefully restrict Microsoft's ability to adapt and expand Apple's GUI designs. This enabled Windows to emerge as a dominant platform in the 1990s, destroying Apple's market exclusivity over intuitive GUIs. Apple's fatal oversight in 1985 not only cost it years in court, but also contributed to a decade of Microsoft's ascendancy. By 2000, Microsoft's market cap had reached $375 billion, and Apple's had fallen to just $5 billion. It wasn't until Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1996, re-established the important relationship between Apple and Microsoft, and initiated new and uniquely creative products like the iPod, 2001, iPhone, 2007, and iPad, 2010, that Apple began to recover its preeminence in the global markets. By 2010, Apple had regained the greater share of investment funding and has remained in that position ever since, but it was nearly destroyed by a simple contractual oversight in 1985. The terms of repayment for loans made to Oasis International Group are clearly explicit in paragraph 1 of the promissory note and loan agreement, which every lender was required to sign before OIG would accept their money. All prior investments in Oasis Management were either returned to each of Oasis Management's investors or, alternatively, at the direction of an OM investor, rolled into loans for Oasis International Group during 2017 and 2018. By the end of March 2019, anyone who had not signed the OIG promissory note and loan agreement received all of their money back. All funds loaned became the property of Oasis International Group under the terms of the promissory note agreement and risk disclosure. The agreement specified the terms highlighted here in yellow for repayment of interest earned on loaned funds. The transaction fees referenced in the agreement were earned through spread fees charged by the Forex broker-dealer that OIG controlled. In another video, we will cover in greater detail how those transactions fees were earned and how they often produced enough income for OIG to pay more than the minimum 1% per month agreed to in the promissory note. The agreement is unequivocal and clear. There is no provision in it for the lender, referred to as the payee, to participate in any of the investments OIG made through use of loaned money. Whether or not OIG's investments in precious metals, real estate, businesses or Forex exchange operations produced profits or losses was entirely immaterial and unrelated to the lender's relationship with OIG. Lenders secured no interest in any of them. Their sole expectation of benefit from the promissory note rested on the company's ability to pay the promised interest, which it did without fail whenever requested. Otherwise, as specified in the agreement, when a lender did not request payment of earned monthly interest, it was automatically rolled into the following month and considered part of that month's opening principal balance.
By misrepresenting or simply ignoring the terms of Oasis' promissory note and agreement, the government found it expedient to convince its naive lender witnesses and the jury at Michael DeCorta's criminal trial that OIG, and Michael in particular, had defrauded them. That fabricated falsehood, based as it was on false impressions, misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and inadequate research, cost hundreds of people their life savings, years of anguish, distressed circumstances, and more for no justifiable reason. As we said before, when the power of state authority intervenes, interpretation may be weaponized to serve interests that have little or nothing to do with the original parties to a case. The law, though intended to uphold fairness, justice, and equity, can be twisted not to protect the lender or the borrower, but instead to serve the interests of those in control.